Welcome back for another deep dive. Lately I've been doing a lot of reading about data privacy and how websites are tracking everything we do online.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and this whole thing about server-side tracking keeps popping up. I'm super curious to understand what it all means for the future of data, analytics and stuff. So I thought we'd take a deep dive into this whole server-side tracking thing.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, like what are the benefits? What are the challenges? Is it really all it's cracked up to be? What do you think?
It's a hot topic for sure, and for good reason. It feels like we're at this point where user privacy and data collection are kind of on a collision course.
Right.
And a lot of people see server-side tracking as a way to maybe find a balance between those two things.
Yeah, I've even seen articles saying that some big companies like Spotify and Uber are already using it in the name of privacy. But I'll be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on how it all works.
Right.
I always thought all the tracking stuff happened through our browsers, right?
Right, that's the traditional method, what we call client-side tracking.
Yep.
But with server-side tracking, the actual data processing happens on the company's server
Hmm.
before it even gets sent to those third-party analytics tools. So instead of relying on code that runs in your browser, the company kind of acts as the middleman, controlling the data flow.
So it's not about stopping data collection entirely.
Right.
It's more about controlling what data gets shared and who gets to see it.
You got it. A good analogy might be like, imagine you're sending a postcard to a friend
Okay.
and you want to include a little secret message just for them. So you write the main message on the postcard itself,
Okay.
but then you tuck a separate note, the secret one, inside an envelope.
I get it.
Server-side tracking is kind of similar. Some data is sent openly, like the message on the postcard,
Okay.
but other bits are handled more discreetly on the company's server.
In the envelope.
Exactly, before it's passed along to those third-party tools.
Okay, that actually makes it much clearer.
Hmm.
But why go through all this extra trouble? Why not just stick with the old way of doing things?
Well, there are a couple of big reasons. First off, remember all those headlines about GDPR and CCPA?
Oh yeah, those data privacy laws.
Exactly. Well, those privacy regulations are only getting tougher all around the world, and consumers are becoming a lot more aware of how companies are using their data.
Right.
And the old client-side tracking methods are starting to clash with these new rules. Big time.
Yeah, it's not just regulations though, is it? I feel like every time I open a web browser now, I get bombarded with these cookie pop-ups and privacy settings. It's like whack-a-mole trying to manage my privacy online.
It's overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
And that's another reason server-side tracking is becoming so important. We have the rise of ad blockers and all these browser features designed to block tracking.
Makes it hard for companies to collect data the old way.
It does. It's becoming a lot harder to just rely on those client-side methods. For example, Apple has this thing called Intelligent Tracking Prevention, or ITP.
I've heard of that.
It actually limits how companies can track users across different websites. So server-side tracking is kind of a way for companies to adapt to this new world where everyone is more privacy conscious.
It's like they're evolving, right?
Exactly. It gives them more control over that whole data collection process, helps them work around these new privacy hurdles, and, stay on the right side of the law. It's not about being sneaky. It's about finding a way to still gather insights while respecting people's preferences and staying legal.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I'm also seeing a lot of people talk about how server-side tracking can improve data accuracy. Is that really a big difference compared to the old way?
Oh, it can be a huge difference. See, with client-side tracking, the code is running on the user's device, which can be affected by all sorts of things.
Yeah, like what?
Well, you've got ad blockers, browser settings, even just a bad internet connection.
Oh, that makes sense.
All of those things can lead to data getting lost or messed up, but server-side tracking reduces those risks because the company is collecting the data directly on their server.
It's like having a dedicated line.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. It's a much more secure and reliable way to transmit data. It's like comparing, a carrier pigeon to a high-speed fiber optic cable.
Okay, I get the picture.
Yeah.
But it's not just about accuracy, right? Are there any other advantages to using this server-side approach?
For sure. It's not just about the quality of the data, but also the speed. Since all the hard work of processing the data happens on the server, it actually frees up resources on the user's device.
Oh, interesting.
So websites can load faster and the whole online experience becomes smoother.
So it's like a win-win, potentially.
Exactly. Businesses get better data and users get a faster, less frustrating browsing experience.
I like the sound of that.
Of course, how well it all works depends on how well the server-side tracking is implemented. It's not some magic solution.
Right.
But when it's done right, it can definitely make things better for everyone.
Now, this all sounds incredibly promising, but I have to ask, are there any downsides? Nothing's ever perfect, right? What's happened?
You're absolutely right. There are definitely some challenges. Probably the biggest one is that it can be pretty technically complex to set up.
I can imagine.
Managing a server-side tracking system requires specialized skills. And that can be a big hurdle for smaller companies, the ones without a lot of technical resources.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And even for teams that are used to the old way of doing things, the learning curve can be pretty steep. It requires a whole new way of thinking about data and how it flows. Plus, there's the cost of running and maintaining all that server infrastructure.
So it's more complex and potentially more expensive. But for the companies that are willing to take the plunge, what are the main benefits they can expect?
Well, on top of the accuracy and privacy benefits we talked about, one of the biggest advantages is the amount of control it gives companies over their data.
Oh.
With server-side tracking, you're essentially building your own data pipeline, which means you can customize how data is collected and processed in ways that you just can't do with the old client-side tracking.
So it's like having a custom-built engine for your data.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You can transform, enrich, even manipulate the data to fit the specific needs of your business and the tools you use. Like, you could even integrate tracking data with your CRM system or other databases to create a much more complete view of your customers.
That's really powerful.
It is. It opens up a whole new level of insights.
Wow, I'm starting to see why people are so excited about this. It's not just swapping out some code. It's a fundamental shift in how businesses approach data.
Absolutely. It's like a paradigm shift that forces everyone to think about data more strategically.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the benefits for businesses, but what about us, the users? What's the impact on us? We briefly touched on faster websites, but are there any other noticeable effects?
Yeah, well, the most direct impact is on privacy, as we've discussed.
Mm-hmm.
Server-side tracking gives companies more ways to protect user data and comply with those regulations.
Which is a good thing for everyone who cares about how their information is being used online, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I know I'm definitely paying more attention to those cookie pop-ups and privacy settings these days.
Me too.
And it's not just about avoiding annoying pop-ups. It's about creating a more transparent and user-friendly online experience. One where you feel more in control of your data. Plus, there are those performance improvements we talked about.
Right, faster loading times.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between driving a car with a sputtering engine and one that glides smoothly down the road.
Okay, now that's a comparison I can relate to.
And, faster page load times and fewer clunky scripts running in the background can really make a noticeable difference in how you experience the internet.
Speaking of real-world examples, are there any companies out there that are really doing this well, like knocking server-side tracking out of the park?
Oh, for sure. Spotify and Uber, those are just the tip of the iceberg. Companies like Walmart, Airbnb, even smaller e-commerce businesses are using server-side tracking.
Wow.
They're using it to get better insights, improve user experience, and strengthen their data privacy practices.
It really does sound like it's becoming the new standard for data collection, especially in a world that's becoming more and more privacy conscious.
It's definitely on that path. And you know how we never even think about SSL certificates anymore? Like it's just an expected part of website security? I wouldn't be surprised if server-side tracking becomes just as commonplace.
Really?
Yeah, like baked into the foundation of how websites and apps are built.
That's a fascinating thought. So if that happens, what does it mean for the future of data analytics and marketing?
That's the big question, isn't it? It could mean a future where data is treated with a lot more respect, more transparency. Users have more control over their information, and businesses have to be a lot more thoughtful about how they collect and use it.
A more ethical approach to data overall.
That's the hope, right? It won't happen overnight, of course. But I think server-side tracking is a big step in that direction. It's making everyone rethink how we use data, how it affects privacy, and what that means for how people experience the internet.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful thought.
Yeah, it feels like we're on the edge of some major changes in the digital world.
It does. And as we wrap up part one of our deep dive into server-side tracking, that's a great place to stop and let those ideas sink in.
It sounds like we are indeed on the cusp of a very different internet experience.
We are. In the next part, we'll get a little more hands-on, explore how this server-side tracking is actually implemented. We'll dive into those technical details, but don't worry, we'll keep it clear and engaging.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so we've covered the why of server-side tracking. But now I'm really curious about the how. Like, how do you actually set this whole thing up? I'm guessing it's not as simple as just flipping a switch, right?
You're right about that. There are definitely a few moving parts. It's kind of like building a custom data pipeline. You need to set up a dedicated space on a server to handle all this data before it goes anywhere else. This is usually called a server-side container.
A server-side container. So is that like a central command center for all your data? What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, there are a few options. You can actually build your own container from scratch,
Oh, wow.
which gives you a ton of flexibility but also requires a lot of technical know-how. Or you can use platforms that are designed for server-side tracking, like Google Tag Manager has a server-side offering.
Ah, Google Tag Manager. I've used that for client-side tracking before. Is the server-side version similar?
It uses some of the same ideas and even the same interface, but it's way more powerful and flexible. It's
Oh,
like client-side Google Tag Manager is like having a basic toolbox, whereas the server-side version is like having a full-blown workshop at your fingertips.
okay.
You have so much more control over how data is handled and where it gets sent.
Interesting. But how does data actually get from my website or my app to this server-side container? Doesn't magically teleport, right?
Not yet at least. It actually uses APIs. They act as messengers between different systems. You set up APIs to send data from your website or app to the container.
So my website basically says, hey, server-side container, here's some data for you, and the API delivers the message.
Exactly. It's all about setting up that smooth communication between the different parts. And then once the data arrives in the server-side container, that's where things start to get really interesting.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. What kind of interesting are we talking about here? What can you actually do with the data once it's in that container?
For one, you can make sure the data is accurate and clean. It's like a quality control check before the data gets sent off to your analytics tools or marketing platforms.
So you can catch any mistakes or problems before they cause trouble.
Exactly. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. One of the coolest things about server-side tracking is that you can enrich the data with extra information from other places. Let's say you have customer data stored in your CRM system.
Right.
You can use the server-side container to actually combine that CRM data with the tracking data you collect from your website or app.
That's pretty smart.
Yeah. Suddenly you have a much more complete picture of each user.
So you're connecting those dots, right? Instead of having these separate chunks of data, you can see how everything fits together.
You got it. And it's not just about adding to the data. You can also change it into totally different formats. Like one analytics platform might want the data in a certain way, while another platform needs it structured differently. The container is like a universal translator, making sure the data speaks the right language for each tool.
Wow, so it's like a data playground where you can shape the information however you need.
Exactly. It gives you so much power and flexibility.
I can see that. Okay, this is all starting to sound very powerful, but also pretty technical.
Yeah.
What kind of skills do you need to make this all work? Is this something a regular marketer can handle, or do I need a team of developers?
It definitely helps to have some technical skills. You'll need to know how to work with APIs, server-side code, and maybe even cloud infrastructure if you're hosting the container yourself. It's usually a team effort between developers, data engineers, and marketing folks.
So not exactly a DIY project for someone who's more comfortable with spreadsheets than code.
Probably not. But even if you're not super technical, it's still really important to understand the basics of how server-side tracking works. That way you can have better conversations with your developers and make smart decisions about your data strategy.
Makes sense. So speaking of strategy, how does this whole server-side tracking thing change how marketing and analytics teams do their jobs? Is it a total overhaul?
It can definitely be a big shift. It's not just about implementing the technology, it's also about changing how you think about data. Marketing and analytics teams need to learn new tools and workflows. They need to understand how server-side tracking changes the data they're getting and how to interpret it correctly.
So it's more than just learning the tech stuff. It's about understanding how data flows from point A to point B and all the steps in between.
Exactly. It takes a real team effort, with both technical and marketing folks working closely together. Everyone needs to be on the same page and understand the overall data strategy.
Okay, I can see how this can be a game changer for businesses, but I have to admit, it's still a lot to take in. Can we maybe break it down a bit further? Like, can you give me a real-world example of how a company might use server-side tracking?
Sure. Let's look at an example that's relevant to a lot of businesses. Tracking purchases on an e-commerce website.
Okay.
The traditional way to do this would be to use a pixel that triggers in the user's browser when they buy something.
Right.
It sends data straight to your analytics platform. But with server-side tracking, you can actually skip the browser entirely.
Right?
Yeah, you capture those purchase events directly from your server.
So instead of relying on that pixel to fire correctly in the browser,
Hmm.
which can be unreliable with ad blockers and stuff, the data gets sent straight from my server to
Yeah.
the analytics platform.
You got it. It's a much more reliable and accurate way to track conversions, especially now that people are more concerned about privacy and blocking trackers.
That makes a lot of sense. And because everything's happening on the server, I'm guessing you can do more with that purchase data, right? Like
Yeah.
combine it with other customer information to get a better sense of their buying habits.
Exactly. Let's say you have a customer loyalty program. You could use the server-side container to connect that purchase data with the customer's loyalty status or their lifetime value.
Hmm.
That gives you a much deeper understanding of their behavior.
Right.
And you can use that to create more targeted and effective marketing campaigns.
Wow. I'm starting to see how powerful this can be. It's not just about tracking. It's about actually connecting those dots
Yeah,
and using data to make better business decisions.
you're getting it.
Yeah.
But I know the process of setting this up can still seem kind of abstract. Maybe we can walk through the steps involved using that purchase tracking example.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, let's say you're using Google Tag Manager's server-side offering. First, you create a server-side container within your Google Tag Manager account. This is that dedicated space on the server where all the data magic happens.
So this is like laying the foundation for your data pipeline.
Exactly. Next, you create what's called a client within that container. Think of it as a specific channel for data from a particular source. In our case, it would be a client to receive purchase data from your e-commerce platform.
Okay, so it's like telling the container, hey, be ready to accept purchase data from over here.
That's it. Then you set up a tag inside the container. This tag tells the container where to send the processed data. It could be Google Analytics, Facebook ads, your CRM, any platform that can work with server-side data.
So the tag is like the delivery instructions for the data. Once you process this purchase data, send it over here.
You got it. You're telling the container exactly what to do with the data. Of course, you have to set up the tag with the right settings and login info for your specific platform.
All right, so I've got the container, the client, and the tag. What's next?
Now you have to connect all the pieces. Instead of your e-commerce platform sending data directly to your analytics platform, you need to modify the code to send it to your server-side container first.
So I'm basically rerouting the data to go through my server on its way to the final destination.
Exactly. Instead of sending data straight to Google Analytics, for example, your website sends it to the container. Then the container processes it and sends it along to Google Analytics.
Okay, so the data takes a little detour through my server. That makes sense.
Okay.
But how do I actually change my e-commerce platform's code to do that?
That's where things can get a little technical. It really depends on your specific e-commerce platform.
Okay.
You might need to use their API, or you might need a developer to help you integrate some code.
Okay, so that's where I might need to call in the tech experts. But let's say I get the coding part figured out. What about testing? How do I make sure everything is working correctly and the data is going where it's supposed to go?
Testing is super important with server-side tracking. You want to be absolutely sure that data is being collected, processed, and delivered the right way. Luckily, platforms like Google Tag Manager have a server-side preview and debug mode. It lets you see exactly what data is being sent and how it's being handled every step of the way.
So it's like having X-ray vision into your data pipeline.
You got it. You can follow each event, see what data is being sent, and make sure it's formatted correctly for each platform. It's a really powerful tool for troubleshooting and making sure everything is working smoothly.
That sounds super helpful for catching any errors before they become big problems. Are there any other tools that you recommend for testing server-side setups?
Definitely. There are tons of tools that can help you look at the network traffic and see the raw data that's being sent back and forth. Tools like Charles Proxy or Fiddler are really great for that, especially if you need to dig into the nitty-gritty details of how the data is structured.
Wow, it's amazing how much control and visibility you get with server-side tracking. But I guess with great power comes great responsibility, right? It seems like there's a lot that can go wrong if you're not careful.
Absolutely. You're building your own data infrastructure. That means you're responsible for making sure it's secure, reliable, and complies with all those data privacy regulations.
So it's not something to take lightly.
Definitely not. It takes careful planning, meticulous implementation, and constant monitoring to make sure everything is working right and that you're protecting user data. But the payoff can be huge.
Okay, so let's say I've set up the container. I've got the clients and tags configured. My e-commerce platform's code is modified, and I've tested everything thoroughly. What's the last step? Am I finally done?
Not quite. The final step, and probably the most important one, is to monitor and iterate. Server-side tracking is not a set it and forget it kind of thing. You need to constantly monitor the data, keep an eye out for any weird stuff or errors, and adjust your setup as needed.
So it's a process of constant improvement, basically.
Exactly. Your business is going to grow, people's behavior online is going to change, and privacy rules are going to keep evolving. You have to make sure your server-side tracking system can keep up. It's a journey of learning, refining, and making your data strategy better and better.
You've definitely sold me on the power of server-side tracking. But is this something that's only for big companies with lots of resources? Can smaller businesses actually benefit from this too?
That's a great question. It's true that server-side tracking can be more complicated to set up, but the good news is there are solutions out there for businesses of all sizes. You don't necessarily need a huge team of developers to get started.
Oh, that's good to know. So even a small online store with limited technical resources could use server-side tracking.
Definitely. There are platforms that offer simplified server-side tracking solutions that are easier to manage, even without a dedicated dev team.
That's really encouraging. What are the most important things for smaller businesses to think about when they're looking at these different server-side tracking options?
Well, I think the first thing is to figure out exactly what they need and what their goals are. What data are they trying to collect? How much control and flexibility do they need? How important is privacy to them? Once they have a clear picture of what they want to achieve, they can start exploring different solutions and see what fits best.
So find a solution that matches their goals and their resources.
Exactly. It's also a good idea to look for solutions that have good documentation, support, and community resources. Having a strong support system is really helpful when you're diving into server-side tracking, especially for smaller teams.
That makes sense. And I'm guessing cost is a big factor for smaller businesses too.
Absolutely. They need to carefully consider the pricing of each option and make sure it fits within their budget. Some platforms charge based on how much you use, while others have a fixed monthly fee. It's all about understanding the costs and making sure they make sense for the business.
All right, so server-side tracking isn't just for the big guys. Even smaller businesses can take advantage of it if they choose the right solution and approach it strategically.
You got it. The key is to do your homework, understand the pros and cons, and find a partner that can guide you through the whole process.
We've covered so much ground here. We've talked about the technical side, the challenges, the opportunities of server-side tracking. But before we move on to what's next for this technology, I want to touch on something that's been on my mind throughout this whole conversation.
What's that?
We've been focusing on all the technical aspects and the benefits for businesses, but what about the bigger picture? What about the impact on users? I get that server-side tracking can give companies more control over data and potentially improve privacy, but is there a chance it could be used for bad or lead to even more intrusive tracking practices?
That's a really important question. We have to remember that technology itself is neutral. It's all about how we choose to use it. Server-side tracking provides more tools for protecting privacy, but in the end, it all comes down to the businesses implementing it. They have to use those tools responsibly and ethically.
So it's not a guarantee of privacy, but a way to make privacy possible if people use it with the right intentions.
Exactly. It's about creating a more ethical way of collecting data, being transparent, and building trust. That takes effort from businesses, technology developers, and users. We all have to work together to make sure data is handled respectfully and responsibly.
I really appreciate that perspective. It's a good reminder that any new technology comes with risks, and server-side tracking is no exception. But it seems like it also has the potential to make the online world a better place, where users have more control over their data and where the relationship between businesses and customers is more transparent.
I agree. This is an ongoing conversation. We all need to be part of it and make sure technology serves us, not the other way around.
Well said. And that's a perfect transition to the final part of our deep dive. We're going to explore what the future holds for server-side tracking and how it might impact the whole digital landscape.
I'm looking forward to that. There are so many exciting possibilities and some big challenges too. Server-side tracking is right at the center of all of it.
Okay, so we've talked about what server-side tracking is and how it actually works.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious about the big picture. Where is all this headed? What does the future hold for server-side tracking and how it might impact the whole digital world?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I think the future of server-side tracking is really connected to some of the big things that are already shaping the internet.
Like what?
like how privacy rules are getting stricter, the rise of AI, and how important data is becoming for pretty much every business.
Okay, yeah, let's break those down one by one. We've talked a lot about privacy already, but it seems like the regulations and what people expect are only going to get tougher. How will server-side tracking keep up with a world that's more and more focused on privacy?
I think as privacy becomes even more important, server-side tracking will probably go from being something businesses like to have to something they absolutely need.
Hmm.
It might even become the default way that companies handle data collection. Like, think about it. You wouldn't run a website without HTTPS these days, right?
Right, you need those security certificates.
Exactly. SSL certificates are just the norm now for website security. And I think server-side tracking could go the same way, becoming a standard part of how websites and apps are built. It could create this baseline level of data protection and control.
Interesting. Makes you wonder what else about the internet might change as people care more about their privacy. What about AI? I keep hearing about how artificial intelligence is being used to analyze data and do all sorts of amazing things. Where does server-side tracking fit into this AI-powered future?
It's a really good fit, actually. Server-side tracking gives you a way to structure your data in a way that makes it much easier for AI to work with. Instead of having all this messy, inconsistent data from different sources, you can use that server-side container to clean it up, standardize it, and add more information to it. That makes the data so much more valuable for AI algorithms.
So it's like setting the stage for some really powerful AI applications, right? In marketing, analytics, all that stuff.
Exactly. Imagine being able to personalize someone's experience on a website in real time based on what they've done before and what they like.
Wow.
Or being able to predict with really high accuracy which customers might leave based on their purchase history, website activity, and all kinds of other information. Server-side tracking can help make those AI-powered dreams a reality.
That's pretty incredible, but also a little bit scary, to be honest. It feels like we're on the verge of some really big changes in how businesses work and how they interact with people.
Yeah, I think you're right. The combination of server-side tracking, AI, and this big push for data privacy is going to change the game completely. The businesses that embrace these changes, invest in the right technologies, and focus on using data ethically, those are the ones that are going to succeed.
So it's not just about implementing some new technology, it's a whole new way of thinking about data.
Absolutely. It's a shift from just collecting as much data as you can to being more thoughtful and responsible.
Right.
It's about using data to make things better for users, not to take advantage of them.
That's a great point. It seems like server-side tracking, even though it's technically complicated, could actually help businesses and their customers get along better. It could create a more open and trustworthy environment for data.
I think that's definitely possible. And as the technology gets even better, who knows what new things we'll be able to do with it. It's a really exciting time to be involved in this field.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into server-side tracking, what's the one big takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that server-side tracking is more than just a technical thing. It's a big decision that can have a huge impact on your business, your customers, and how we think about data in general. It's about control, privacy, accuracy, and making sure we use information in a way that's ethical and fair.
It sounds like server-side tracking is just one piece of a much bigger picture,
Yeah.
one that involves technology, ethics, and figuring out how businesses and people can work together in a world that's driven by data.
You said it perfectly. And as the digital world keeps changing so fast, it's really important to stay on top of these trends and make sure your strategies can keep up.
Well said. We hope you found this deep dive helpful and interesting. And as always, keep learning and exploring the world of data because it's not going anywhere. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.